You believe you have fully grasped the legend of Bruce Lee. You have analyzed the screams, the iconic kicks, and the philosophy that captivated the world. But until you hear the testimony of the giant who stood in his shadow, your understanding remains incomplete. Bolo Yeung, a colossus of physical power, entered Hollywood believing he was the apex predator, only to be stunned by a reality he had never anticipated. He didn't just find a co-star. He found a universe of martial science that dismantled his understanding of combat. From the shock of their first interaction, where his massive strength was rendered useless by Bruce's physics, to the present day where Bolo teaches these very secrets to his own students, this is the story of a transformation. The Beast of the East has a confession to make, not of rivalry, but of a profound, life-altering gratitude toward the master who taught him how to truly move. The Sacred Alliance, a titan tamed by wisdom. To truly understand the magnitude of the bond between these two icons, one must strip away the layers of cinema history and transport oneself back to the humidity and neon of 1970s Hong Kong. This was an era where martial arts were often divided by rigid sectarian lines, where styles did not mix, and secrets were jealously guarded by masters who viewed outsiders with suspicion. Into this environment walked Bolo Yeung, a man who was a physical anomaly. He was a champion of Shotokan karate and a competitive bodybuilder, a man who had constructed his body into a fortress of dense muscle and iron will. When he was cast alongside Bruce Lee for a Winston cigarettes commercial, Bolo approached the meeting with the confidence of a man who had never physically been dominated. He saw Bruce Lee not as a master, but as a smaller actor, a charismatic figure perhaps, but surely not a physical threat to a man who could deadlift a car. However, the reality of that first meeting was a psychological earthquake for the giant. When they first touched hands, not in anger but in greeting and casual testing, Bolo felt something that defied his logic, a density and a vibration of power that seemed to emanate from the marrow of Bruce's bones rather than the size of his biceps. It was the shock of a sledgehammer wrapped in velvet, a moment where the laws of physics seemed to bend around the smaller man. Bruce Lee, recognizing the potential in Bolo's massive frame, did not choose to intimidate the giant or humiliate him, which would have been the standard response in the ego-driven world of martial arts. Instead, Bruce looked at Bolo with the eyes of a sculptor seeing a block of marble. He saw the stiffness in the shoulders, the breaks in the hips caused by heavy lifting, and the telegraphing of intent. Bruce immediately began to dismantle Bolo's reliance on brute force, explaining the concept of non-telegraphic motion. He demonstrated that by the time Bolo's brain sent the signal to his massive arm to throw a punch, Bruce had already entered his guard, struck, and exited. This wasn't magic. It was superior neurology and biomechanics. Bolo, who had spent his life adding armor to his body, was suddenly told that his armor was his prison. He had to make a choice, cling to his ego and remain a strong man, or humble himself and become a martial artist. He chose the latter, embarking on a painful but enlightening process of unlearning. He began to view his own strength not as the weapon, but as the engine that needed a better driver. Was this the pivotal moment where the beast realized that his physical strength was merely a canvas for the master, to paint a masterpiece of movement upon, effectively saving him from a career of mediocrity? The relationship deepened on the set of Enter the Dragon. While the script called for them to be enemies, the reality behind the scenes was a masterclass in mentorship. Bruce Lee was famously protective of his training methods, yet with Bolo he was an open book. They would spend hours in the Kowloon Tong estate, where Bruce would physically guide Bolo's hips, correcting the alignment of his spine to maximize power generation. Bruce taught Bolo that relaxation was not weakness but the prerequisite for explosive speed. For a bodybuilder whose entire discipline is based on tension and the pump, this was a radical, almost heretical concept. Bolo had to learn to turn his muscles off so they could be turned on instantly. He describes these sessions with a sense of reverence, noting that Bruce was patient, kind, and incredibly generous with his time. Bruce understood that Bolo represented the yang, hard, to his yin, soft, and he wanted to help Bolo find the balance. This was not the behavior of a superstar protecting his spot. It was the behavior of a teacher who wanted to raise the level of the entire art form. Bolo absorbed these lessons like a sponge, realizing that every minute spent with Bruce was worth a decade in a traditional dojo. He stopped training to look good for the camera and started training to be functional for the fight. Why did Bruce Lee, a man who was constantly challenged and threatened by rivals, choose to open the library of his deadliest knowledge to the one man physically capable of crushing him if he ever decided to turn traitor. The impact of this mentorship is visible in Bolo's career longevity. While other action stars from the 70s faded away, broken by injuries or unable to adapt, Bolo Yeung continued to perform at a high level for decades. This endurance is a direct result of the water philosophy Bruce instilled in him. Bruce taught him how to recover, how to stretch, and how to maintain mobility despite his mass. Bolo transformed his diet, moving away from the heavy, sluggish meals of a powerlifter to the high-fuel efficiency diet that Bruce utilized. He learned to listen to his body, to treat it as an instrument rather than a tool. Every time Bolo appeared on screen in the 80s and 90s, dominating Jean-Claude Van Damme or others, he was using the foundational movements Bruce gave him. He was the villain on the poster, but in his heart he was the faithful student carrying the torch. He never bragged about what he knew, he simply demonstrated it. His silence was a form of respect, a way of honoring the private nature of the lessons. He knew that the world wanted the myth of the dragon, but he held the truth of the man. This bond went beyond mere physical training. It was an intellectual awakening for Bolo Yeung. In the rough and tumble world of Hong Kong stuntmen, intellect was often undervalued. You were paid to fall, to bleed, and to look intimidating. But Bruce engaged Bolo's mind. They would discuss the philosophy of combat, the works of Krishnamurti, and the Taoist principles that underpinned Jeet Kune. Bolo, often typecast as the mindless brute, found in Bruce the only person who treated him as an intellectual equal capable of grasping high-level concepts. Bruce would challenge Bolo to explain why a technique worked, forcing the giant to articulate the physics of his own body. This Socratic method of teaching instilled a deep sense of self-worth in Bolo. He wasn't just a prop in Bruce's movie. He was a researched case study in the efficacy of the art. When Bruce spoke of honest self-expression, he encouraged Bolo to find his own truth within the martial arts, not just to copy the master. This is why Bolo never became a Bruce Lee clone like so many others. He remained Bolo, but a sharper, faster, more enlightened version of himself. He kept his size, but he adopted the soul of the dragon. Furthermore, the emotional context of this alliance cannot be overstated. The 1970s was a lonely time for Bruce Lee. He was besieged by challengers, harassed by the press, and under immense pressure from the studios. In Bolo, he found a quiet, steady presence, a mountain that could not be moved by the petty gossip of the industry. Bolo became a confidant, a training partner who didn't want anything from Bruce other than knowledge. This purity of intent cemented their brotherhood. While others approached Bruce with hidden agendas, looking for roles or money, Bolo approached him with the empty cup of a student. This is perhaps why Bruce gave him so much. He saw that Bolo would respect the gift. 50 years later, that respect remains unbroken. Bolo's refusal to cash in on cheap tell-all books or sensationalist stories is the ultimate proof of the quality of their alliance. It was a sacred trust, forged in sweat and sealed in silence, a testament to the character of both the teacher and the student. Is it possible that the greatest lesson Bruce Lee ever taught Bolo Yeung was not how to punch or kick, but how to maintain dignity in a world that only wanted to see them as spectacles of violence? The autopsy of a ghost, witnessing the impossible. Bolo Yeung stands today as a unique historical artifact, the black box of the Jeet Kune phenomenon. He is one of the very few human beings still walking the earth who felt the full, unfiltered frequency of Bruce Lee's kinetic energy, not through the lens of a camera, but through the bruising reality of physical contact. When Bolo speaks of Bruce's martial arts, he does not use the hyperbolic language of a fan. He uses the precise, anatomical language of a witness who has seen the impossible made manifest. He describes the famous one-inch punch not as a mystical Kai trick performed for applause, but as a terrifying lesson in physics and kinetic linking that defied his understanding of mass. Bolo recounts standing with the heavy pads, bracing his 200-pound frame, planting his feet into the floor with the confidence of a sumo wrestler, certain that no man of 140 pounds could move him without a significant run-up. Then, he describes a sensation that felt less like a human punch and more like a car crash concentrated into the size of a knuckle. The impact did not just push him backwards. It vibrated through his skeleton, rattling his teeth and disrupting his equilibrium in a way that left him nauseous. He realized in that nanosecond that Bruce had found a way to align his toes, knees, hips, spine, and shoulder into a single, rigid lance of energy that fired instantaneously. It was a revelation that shattered Bolo's bodybuilding mindset, teaching him that true power was not about the volume of the muscle, but the efficiency of the transmission. If the camera adds 10 pounds to an actor, does it also subtract the terrifying reality of speed, making it impossible for us to truly comprehend what Bolo saw when he says the movement happened in the spaces between the blinks of an eye? The witness also provides a detailed, almost clinical account of the dark science behind this perfection. Bolo saw the lengths to which Bruce would go to optimize his biology, methods that were decades ahead of their time and often viewed with suspicion by the traditional community. He describes visiting Bruce's private sanctuary and seeing him strapped to electric muscle stimulation, EMS, machines, his muscles twitching rhythmically under high voltage while he read philosophy or wrote scripts. While the traditional martial arts masters of the era viewed weightlifting as detrimental and technology as cheating, Bolo viewed these experiments with a mixture of shock and awe. He saw a man who was trying to hack the human operating system, bypassing the central nervous system's natural fatigue mechanisms to recruit high-threshold motor units that normal training could not touch. Bruce explained to Bolo that the brain limits the muscle to protect the body, but to be the best, one had to override those safeties. Bolo, a man who had built his own body with iron and sweat, was humbled by Bruce's willingness to suffer for his art. He saw the result of this madness: forearms that felt like steel cables wrapped in silk, and a reaction time that bordered on precognition. This was not a man satisfied with tradition. This was a scientist unsatisfied with the limits of humanity, and Bolo was the privileged observer of this evolution. Is it possible that Bolo's signature, villainous, calmness in his later movies was actually a subconscious imitation of the supreme, quiet confidence he saw in Bruce? A confidence that didn't need to shout to be felt because it knew it was lethal. Furthermore, Bolo recounts the intellectual rigor that Bruce demanded, a side of the training that the movies never showed. Bruce would not let Bolo simply copy a move. He demanded to know why Bolo was doing it. Why is your weight on your back foot? Why is your thumb positioned there? He treated Bolo not as a hired thug, but as an intellectual peer capable of grasping deep biomechanical concepts. This elevated Bolo's self-worth significantly. In an industry that saw him only as a body to be beaten, Bruce saw a mind to be sharpened. They would sketch out diagrams of footwork, analyzing the geometry of attack angles like architects planning a demolition. Bruce shared his private notes on fencing and boxing, showing Bolo how the footwork of Muhammad Ali could be adapted for kicking, and how the parries of a fencer could be applied to a fistfight. Bolo realized that Jeet Kune was not a style to be memorized, but a research methodology to be applied. He took this analytical approach and applied it to his own training, becoming a student of movement rather than just a lifter of weights. This intellectual gift was perhaps the most durable legacy Bruce left him, transforming the beast into a scholar of violence. How does a man carry the weight of being the second best for 5 decades? Not with bitterness or jealousy, but with the quiet pride of knowing he was the sharpest stone against which the ultimate sword was honed. The forgotten manuscript, the Grappler and the SHADOWS. The most explosive element of Bolo Yeung's testimony, the critical hit that threatens to shatter the carefully curated image of Bruce Lee held by the general public, is the revelation of the dragon's profound, almost obsessive proficiency in grappling and ground fighting. For over half a century, a persistent and comfortable narrative has existed. Bruce Lee was the ultimate striker, the king of the stand-up game, a man whose feet were lightning and whose fists were stone, but who, according to critics and real fighters, would have been lost the moment his back touched the canvas. This is the argument used by skeptics to dismiss his martial validity in the modern era of mixed martial arts. However, Bolo Yeung, the man who actually stood in the room, destroys this myth with a series of detailed, granular accounts of their private training sessions that paint a completely different picture. He reveals that Bruce Lee was not just aware of grappling. He was actively decoding it, cross-training in judo, jiu-jitsu, and catch wrestling with a fervor that bordered on mania, long before the term MMA was even a whisper in the sporting world. Bolo served as the willing partner, the heavy bag with a pulse, for these groundbreaking experiments. He describes the visceral reality of these sessions with a mixture of awe and lingering disbelief. Bolo was a man of immense static strength, a human forklift capable of overpowering almost anyone in a test of raw force. Yet he recounts moments where Bruce, weighing nearly 60 pounds less, would dismantle that strength using pure geometry. Bruce would close the distance, not to strike, but to clinch, wrapping his sinewy limbs around Bolo's massive frame like a python. He utilized off-balancing techniques, known in judo as kuzushi, to manipulate Bolo's center of gravity. Bolo describes the sensation of being weightless, of his feet leaving the ground not because he was lifted by strength, but because his structural integrity had been hacked. Bruce would execute a tomo nage, circle throw, or a leg sweep with such perfect timing that Bolo felt he was fighting a ghost. Once on the ground, the striker vanished, and a technician emerged. Bruce would isolate a limb, applying torque to the elbow or the knee with a mechanical precision that turned Bolo's massive muscles into liabilities rather than assets. Why has history conveniently ignored the fact that Bruce Lee was actively teaching his students, including Bolo, the art of submission grappling 20 years before the world knew what an armbar was, and 50 years before it became a standard requirement for an action star? This revelation completely recontextualizes the history of combat sports and places Bruce Lee at the very genesis of the MMA revolution, not as a mascot, but as an architect. Bolo explains that Bruce was deeply influenced by his friendship with judo, Jean LaBelle, and his study of wrestling manuals. But Bruce didn't just copy the moves, he adapted them for street survival, which he called the way of the intercepting fist. He taught Bolo that the ground was not a place to rest, but a place to finish. "You must be like water," Bruce would say. "Water takes the shape of the cup. If the fight goes to the ground, you must be the ground." Bolo admits that despite his bench press records, he was often helpless once Bruce secured a leverage point. He recounts being trapped in armbars, heel hooks, and neck cranks, techniques that would not become household names until the Gracie family revolutionized the world in 1993. By sharing these memories, Bolo is effectively crowning Bruce Lee as the prehistoric father of MMA, a man who had already solved the riddle of total combat while the rest of the martial arts world was still arguing about the proper angle of a karate chop. Furthermore, Bolo sheds light on the dirty side of Bruce's grappling, the anti-grappling tactics designed for life-or-death scenarios. Bruce taught him that in a real fight, there are no referees. If Bolo tried to secure a bear hug, Bruce would not just try to break the grip, he would target the small joints, the eyes, or bite. This was the scientific street fighting that Bolo witnessed. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't cinematic, which is perhaps why it was never filmed. Bruce was preparing Bolo for a reality where weight classes didn't exist. He taught Bolo how to use his own mass as a weapon on the ground, how to smother an opponent, and how to create space when pinned. These were advanced concepts of weight distribution that are now standard in Brazilian jiu-jitsu academies, yet they were being drilled in a Hong Kong backyard in 1972. Bolo's testimony suggests that Enter the Dragon's opening fight scene, where Bruce uses an armbar to finish Sammo Hung, was not a throwaway choreographic choice, but a deliberate signal to the world that the game had changed, a signal that went largely ignored for decades. If we accept Bolo's testimony as fact, do we have to rewrite the history books to acknowledge that the father of MMA was not a Brazilian master in the 90s, but a movie star in the 70s who was secretly training his co-stars in the art of total combat? Beyond the grappling, Bolo expounds on an even more sophisticated strategic tool that Bruce drilled into him, the concept of broken rhythm. In traditional martial arts and even in bodybuilding, there is a cadence, a comforting 1-2-3 rhythm. A boxer jabs on 1, crosses on 2. A lifter lifts on 1, lowers on 2. Bruce taught Bolo that this rhythm is a death sentence because it allows the opponent's brain to predict the next beat. Bruce moved in broken rhythm, striking on the half beat, or waiting for the end between the counts. Bolo describes the immense psychological frustration of trying to time Bruce, only to find that the dragon was operating on a completely different, non-linear timeline. Bruce would feint to trigger a reaction, pause for a millisecond to let Bolo's brain commit to a defense, and then strike during the inhalation phase when Bolo's body was momentarily frozen. This was psychological warfare disguised as movement. Bruce compared it to music. Most fighters are marching bands, predictable and rigid. A Jeet Kune fighter must be a jazz drummer, improvisational, syncopated, and impossible to anticipate. Bolo took this lesson to heart, and it became the secret to his on-screen menace. He learned to move with a stillness that was unsettling, breaking the rhythm of the scene itself. But in the dojo, he learned that this broken rhythm was the only way a slower, larger man could defeat a faster opponent. Bruce taught him to use his size to dictate the tempo, to force the opponent to speed up or slow down to match him, and then to disrupt that pattern with a sudden explosion. Bolo applies this heavily in his teaching today. He tells his students to break the pattern, to be chaotic in their timing. This specific technical detail proves that Bruce's legendary speed was not just a result of genetic gifts or physical athleticism, but a cognitive strategy designed to overload the opponent's sensory processing. It was a hacking of the human perception of time. Did Bruce Lee know that by teaching Bolo these secrets, he was planting seeds that would eventually grow into the modern martial arts landscape, ensuring his philosophy would survive even if he didn't? The legacy of this blueprint is evident in how Bolo instructs his current students, serving as a living link to the past. In rare footage of Bolo teaching today, one can see him correcting posture not with the rigidity of the Shotokan he grew up with, but with the fluid, circular motions of Jeet Kune do. He emphasizes the snap, the relaxation before impact, and the importance of the center line, all core tenets of Bruce's philosophy. He demonstrates the grappling entries, showing how a punch can turn into a takedown, seamlessly blending the two worlds just as Bruce did. Bolo often tells his students, "Don't just use muscle, use the floor, use the opponent's energy." He is transmitting the physics lesson he received in 1973. He speaks of Bruce not as a god who cannot be touched, but as a scientist who left behind a formula for solving the problem of violence. Bolo sees himself as the custodian of that formula. He knows that the movies show the fantasy, the screaming, the flexing, the drama, but the training showed the reality, the sweat, the leverage, the science. By sharing these technical details, the grappling, the rhythm, the physics, Bolo is ensuring that the real Bruce Lee is not lost to the movie Bruce Lee. He is validating the martial efficacy of his friend against a generation of skeptics who never felt the grip of the dragon, proving that the principles of combat are universal, provided one has the mind to see them. The third-party perspective, the industry's blindness. Stepping back from the intimate, sweat-soaked dojo of memory and casting a critical eye over the vast, multi-billion-dollar landscape of the global martial arts industry, a troubling and persistent question arises. Why did the world take so long to listen to Bolo Yeung? For decades, the establishment was content to sell Bruce Lee as a two-dimensional icon. The face on a t-shirt, the mystic philosopher on a poster, or the high-kicking action star. They largely ignored, and in some cases actively suppressed, the teacher aspect that Bolo represents, the scientific innovator who was decades ahead of his time. This oversight reveals a systemic blindness, perhaps even a deliberate ignorance, within the traditional martial arts world. The establishment, the ancient dojos with their rigid hierarchies, the belt factories that churned out black belts for profit, had a vested interest in keeping Bruce Lee classified as an entertainer. If they admitted that Bruce Lee, and by extension, his student Bolo, had discovered a superior way of training that involved weightlifting, nutrition, cross-training, and formlessness, it would have invalidated the business models of thousands of traditional schools that relied on mysticism and lineage to survive. Bolo Yeung stood as the living, breathing proof of Bruce's theories, a massive, muscular fighter who moved with fluid grace. Yet the industry preferred to cast him as a villain rather than a visionary, perhaps because acknowledging his transformation would mean acknowledging their own obsolescence. Could it be that the martial arts world was too insecure to admit that a movie star knew more about real fighting than the ancient masters in their dojos, and that his student, a bodybuilder, had unlocked secrets they refused to see? Bolo Yeung represents the bridge between the golden era of kung fu and the modern era of sports science, a link that has been largely unappreciated until now. In the 1970s, there was a strict, almost religious divide. Bodybuilders were seen as slow and muscle-bound, while martial artists were expected to be wiry and fast. Bolo, under Bruce's direct influence, broke that mold completely. He was the prototype of the modern athlete, the linebacker with the agility of a boxer, the powerlifter with the flexibility of a gymnast. Today, looking at the champions of the UFC heavyweight division, one sees athletes who look like Bolo Yeung and move like Bruce Lee. The synthesis that they worked on in private, the marriage of mass and speed, has become the global standard for elite combat sports. Yet, Bolo rarely gets the credit for being the early adopter of this hybrid philosophy. He faced criticism from traditionalists who said he was too big to be a martial artist, just as Bruce faced criticism for being too modern. They were brothers in innovation, fighting a war against stagnation on two fronts. The industry is only now, 50 years later, catching up to the conversations that happened in Bruce Lee's backyard, realizing that the beast was actually the blueprint for the future of fighting. Should we consider Bolo Yeung not just a witness, but a prophet of the Jeet Kune philosophy, carrying the burden of proof in a world that prefers myths over mechanics, and suffering the silence of being misunderstood for half a century? The financial and cultural implications of this ignored truth are staggering. If the world had embraced the Bolo Bruce method of cross-training in the 1970s, mixing heavy weights, grappling, striking, and nutrition, the evolution of human performance would have accelerated by decades. We might have seen the level of athleticism we see today appearing in the 1980s. Instead, the myths persisted. People copied the screams and the haircuts, the surface-level aesthetics of the dragon, but they didn't copy the deadlifts and the grappling drills that built the engine. Bolo held onto the truth, applying it to his own life with quiet discipline, which is why he remains in phenomenal shape, while many of his contemporaries have crumbled under the weight of time and injury. His health is the ultimate validation of Bruce's method. He proves that the high-intensity, scientific approach is sustainable, not destructive. He stands as a rebuke to the no pain, no gain mentality of old-school bodybuilding and the Kai power mysticism of old-school kung fu. He is the successful experiment, the living data point that proves the hypothesis was correct all along. As we look at the billion-dollar UFC industry, do the executives realize they are harvesting the crops from seeds that Bruce Lee planted in the mind of a bodybuilder on a Hong Kong movie set, and that the modern fighter owes a debt to the man who first dared to mix iron and water? The final verdict, the legacy of the open hand. In the final reckoning, the saga of Bolo Yeung and Bruce Lee is not a simple tale of friends or rivals, nor is it merely a footnote in cinema history. It is a love letter to the true spirit of martial arts, a testament to the idea that the greatest strength is not found in the volume of the muscle, but in the openness of the mind. Bruce Lee did not hoard his genius. He poured it into Bolo Yeung, and Bolo Yeung has carried it safely across the ocean of time like a precious vessel, protecting it from the erosion of forgetfulness. The verdict is clear. Bruce Lee was not just a fighter, he was a catalyst. He took a stone mountain and taught it to flow like a river, proving that even the most rigid structures can be transformed by the right philosophy. Will history remember Bolo Yeung merely as the villain who lost on screen, or will it finally recognize him as the faithful student who won the ultimate prize, the wisdom of the dragon? Bolo Yeung's influence on his own students today is the ripple effect of that stone thrown in 1973. Every correction he makes, every piece of advice he gives about relaxing the shoulder or engaging the hip has the DNA of Bruce Lee in it. The dragon is not dead. He is alive in the movement of the beast. The silence has been broken not to destroy a legend, but to humanize a savior. The confession is actually a testament to a friendship that transcended the script, a bond forged in the pursuit of excellence. Can you accept the truth that the most dangerous man on the screen was also the kindest teacher behind the scenes, and that his greatest legacy is not in the movies, but in the men he made better? The statue in Hong Kong stands for the public to visit, a bronze idol frozen in time. But the living legacy breathes in the chest of Bolo Yeung, dynamic and evolving. Subscribe, listen, and learn. The class is still in session, and the master is still teaching through his greatest student.